She may have been nominated for a Primetime Emmy in 2022, but Alexandra Daddario's enormous eyes just weren't enough to carry many movies she was in before she appeared in The White Lotus. But are they still worth watching? While Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson has starred in his fair share of over-the-top disaster movies, 2015's San Andreas has a more realistic premise than most, centering on a real-life tectonic split that has affected California for almost 200 years. Johnson plays a helicopter pilot who teams up with his ex-wife to save lives after a massive 9.1 magnitude quake. Alexandra Daddario plays his daughter, who tries to survive on her own after being abandoned in the chaos. Despite the strong box office performance of San Andreas, reviews criticized its unoriginality and scientific inaccuracy. But despite its many flaws and a 49% score on Rotten Tomatoes, some felt that it was still a fun popcorn movie, even though it was all spectacle and little substance. To Daddario's credit, some reviewers of the film complimented her charming performance. But San Andreas isn't a disaster movie you need to see before you die. One genre Alexandra Daddario has appeared in more frequently than most is horror. Unfortunately, some of those were during the 2000s and 2010s, when some of the worst horror movies ever were made.
Not the beast! Ah! Open my eyes!
While it's far from the bottom of the genre, 2010's Bereavement, a successor to Stephen Mena's indie slasher flick Malevolence, sits with a low 44% rating on Rotten Tomatoes. In Bereavement, Daddario plays Allison, a teen who gets kidnapped by a serial killer. Although Allison shows more smarts than the average indie horror film lead, critics pan the film's over-reliance on violence, with the New York Times' Paul Brunick writing, "I'd sooner touch a 9-volt battery to my tongue than sit through this film again." On the other hand, some reviewers felt that it would appeal to fans of Malevolence. Many reviews of the film from 2010 credit Daddario, not for her performance, but for the overabundance of skin on display throughout the film. It's not the most encouraging audience response for a young actor, but thankfully Daddario has been in much better horror movies since, with less discourse surrounding her body. When We First Met isn't exactly a fresh take on the Groundhog Day time loop narrative, but thankfully it has a lot more going for it than reviewers at the time seemed to recognize. Released on Netflix in 2018, the film stars Adam Devine as Noah, a single man hopelessly in love with his friend Avery, played by Daddario, who's about to get married. Noah ends up sent back to the night he met Avery and is given the opportunity to replay their meeting over and over again in an effort to win her over. It doesn't go well.
I'm sorry my bounty ruined your magical evening. Have a great life.
In a positive review from Decider, Devine's leading man chops were credited, as was Daddario for being, quote, gorgeous and lovely here. Some reviews criticized the film's unoriginality and style of humor, and it currently sits at 43% on Rotten Tomatoes. However, When We First Met definitely deserves more appreciation than that. In fact, it might be one of the best romantic comedy movies you probably haven't seen yet. Few roles were as life-changing for Daddario's career as playing Annabeth Chase in 2010's Percy Jackson and the Olympians: A Lightning Thief. The movie grossed over $200 million at the box office and earned moderate reviews, with some praising its cast while others panned its script. But it was only natural that Hollywood would follow it up with a sequel. That sequel, Percy Jackson's Sea of Monsters, came and went in 2013, with Daddario reprising her role as Annabeth. Many reviews liken the franchise to a Harry Potter knockoff. But Sea of Monsters wasn't without its favorable notices, with Screen Crush writing, "By keeping the plot straightforward and the storytelling clean, it's an odyssey the intended young audience will be glad to take." Sea of Monsters currently sits at 42% on Rotten Tomatoes. The reviews indicate that there's a lot to appeal to casual viewers and young audiences in this film. Sadly, it'll probably be a grueling watch for any Percy Jackson fans, especially with a far more book-accurate Percy Jackson and the Olympians show, which later appeared on Disney+. Director Joe Dante has developed a powerful reputation for making fun movies, from the iconic cult classic Gremlins to 1989's The Burbs. His output has been much less consistent in the 2000s, but 2014 saw him cast Alexandra Daddario in Burying the Ex as Olivia, opposite Anton Yelchin's Max. Max's manipulative ex, played by Ashley Greene, is killed in an accident and rises from the dead as a zombie to interrupt the happy couple. Despite having a strong premise that seems tailor-made for Dante, its 29% rating on Rotten Tomatoes suggests otherwise. Some reviews called Burying the Ex a career low for Dante, with Daddario's likability unable to save what the New York Post called a thudding, sexist screenplay. Other reviews, however, credited the film for being right up Dante's alley. It may not be the most appealing film to the average mainstream movie lover, but for fans of B-horror and Dante's previous work, it may be a hidden gem. In fact, it might actually be a perfect watch for a Halloween movie night, especially if you prefer a supernatural romantic comedy over a violent slasher film.
What do we do now?
Bury your ex?
Can You Keep a Secret was released straight to video on demand in 2019, so it's very likely that even hardcore fans of Alexandra Daddario's work might have missed it. Reviews at the time weren't exactly complimentary, earning it a 29% score on Rotten Tomatoes, though the film is not without its strengths. The movie is a rom-com centered on Daddario's Emma and Tyler Hoechlin's Jack, who meet on an airplane after she gets drunk and spills her guts to him. He remains enigmatic even after she discovers he's the CEO of the company she works at. Variety's review outlined one of the film's biggest strengths, Daddario herself, calling her universally likable and long overdue for strong material in this particular genre and revelatory as a quirky comedic lead. Sadly, Can You Keep a Secret is not without its flaws, as evidenced by reviews criticizing its supporting cast and generic humor. However, it's worth checking out just for Daddario's committed, energetic performance alone, and might even bring comfort to rom-com lovers on a rainy day. The Texas Chainsaw Massacre is one of the most iconic slasher films of all time. Released in 1974, it introduced horror movie audiences to Leatherface, a backwoods cannibal who attacks a group of teenagers. While the franchise has seen many spin-offs and sequels over the years, it wasn't until 2013 that it got a direct follow-up with Texas Chainsaw 3D. The continuation stars Alexandra Daddario as Heather, a woman who discovers her familial relation to the original Leatherface murders, putting her and her friends in grave danger. As far as horror classic cash-ins, Texas Chainsaw 3D plays by the franchise's rules, featuring a lot of cliché moments that happen in every Chainsaw movie. In one of the more kind reviews of the film, one critic for Vulture wrote, "Despite its many clichés and generic indulgences, you want to give it some points for trying." Vulture also commended Daddario's commitment to playing a scream queen who does more than just scream. But unless you're on a mission to marathon the entire Texas Chainsaw Massacre franchise, Texas Chainsaw 3D probably isn't worth your time. There are better slasher movies out there, but more importantly, there are far better Texas Chainsaw movies out there too. By all accounts, having a starring role in a film reboot to the iconic Baywatch TV series should be an enjoyable experience for any actor. Sadly, Baywatch did more harm than good for Daddario. For a film so aggressively lighthearted, how did it end up with a 17% critic score on Rotten Tomatoes? For one, it's a tough act to follow one of the biggest shows in television history. Though the film did decently at the box office, critics pulled it apart, with Rolling Stone writing, "Think of yourself sitting down for a big 2-hour wallow in instant stupid with a vat of popcorn slathered in fake butter and possibly a mound of melted M&Ms on top. It feels great chugging it down, then your stomach hurts. That's Baywatch in a nutshell." Daddario would later cite Baywatch as a reason for her career hitting a dead end prior to being offered the White Lotus. The film still has its positives, like the chemistry between the cast and some decent, if crude, jokes here and there. However, none of it may be enough to make it worth the nearly 2-hour runtime. There have been many reinterpretations of Romeo and Juliet throughout the history of entertainment, including things like West Side Story, Nomeo and Juliet, and Warm Bodies. That meant that 2021's Die in a Gunfight already had decades of art to compete with, which might account for its abysmal reviews and 16% rating on Rotten Tomatoes. Alexandra Daddario is this film's Juliet, who falls for Diego Bonetta's Romeo, despite a long-running feud between their families. The film got its share of positive reviews for its stylistic direction as well as Daddario's layered performance. However, not many critics agreed, with Screen Rant saying, "Die in a Gunfight has all the elements that could work if the film was more put together and the character relationships weren't so hollow." It might appeal to some viewers, but as a whole, there's probably not a lot going for Die in a Gunfight to set it apart from the much better Shakespeare reimaginings in recent years. It's not great news when a film changes titles between a festival premiere and wide release, but even more so when the title Nomis is exchanged for the generic Night Hunter. Nevertheless, Night Hunter should have been right up Alexandra Daddario's alley. The movie centers on a homicide detective played by Henry Cavill and a judge-turned-vigilante played by Ben Kingsley, searching for a serial killer in Minnesota. Daddario plays a fellow police officer, Rachel, who becomes the target of the killer after the investigation goes awry. Unfortunately, even the earliest reviews from the Los Angeles Film Festival deemed Night Hunter derivative and convoluted, with The Hollywood Reporter writing, "The film's starry cast will be a strong selling point, but a plot that's overly complicated rather than genuinely complex may leave audiences wishing for less incident and more clarity." The film ended up garnering a 13% score on Rotten Tomatoes, with other reviewers citing its absurd twists as all the more reason why Night Hunter can be skipped in a marathon of Daddario's filmography. Songbird is an ambitious movie from writer-director Adam Mason, conceived in early March 2020 and completely written, produced, and released by December 2020 via VOD. Alexandra Daddario is one of many talented stars who lent her quarantine time to this project, alongside Craig Robinson, Bradley Whitford, and Demi Moore. Unfortunately, it was probably a waste of time for all involved. Its 9% rating on Rotten Tomatoes probably speaks for itself, but in case that's not convincing enough to deter potential viewers, listen to Brian Tallarico from RogerEbert.com who said, "It's an incredibly frustrating film that feels like it's constantly getting distracted from the story it should be telling, bored by its own ineptitude. You will be too."
I realize now we weren't just delivering packages. We were delivering hope.
Unless you're an audience member dying to relive the worst days of 2020, don't bother with Songbird, as not even Daddario's presence can save it. As its 33% audience score on Rotten Tomatoes implies, there isn't a lot to Baked in Brooklyn. The film stars Josh Brenner from Silicon Valley as David, an amateur weed dealer whose newly acquired taste for the cannabis business ends up isolating him from the people he cares about most. This includes Alexandra Daddario's Kate, his girlfriend, whom he must win back. From hearing the premise alone, it's obvious that Baked in Brooklyn probably doesn't have a lot going for it in terms of surprising plot twists. The film's biggest obstacle is the unlikability of its lead, which the Irish film critic deemed was made even worse in contrast to the inherent charm of Daddario's character, writing, "For a love story to work, it is vital that both people are appealing and engaging in order for the audience to relate to them. In the case of Baked in Brooklyn, 1 out of 2 ain't bad." At the very least, some reviewers thought the actors had chemistry, even if they weren't rooting for David to get the girl. Still, Baked in Brooklyn is proof that any movie can be at least a little entertaining when Daddario is in it. The Layover is one of the few films on Rotten Tomatoes with a 0% score. Released in 2017, it has strong talent behind the camera, from director William H. Macy to co-writer David Hornsby. Daddario stars with Kate Upton as 2 roommates whose trip to Florida is derailed by a hurricane. They end up stranded in a motel with fellow passenger Ryan, played by Matt Barr, and subsequently battle for his affection. While it may seem like a film with a terrible Rotten Tomatoes score has no redeemable qualities, that's far from the truth here. Yes, the film is ultimately not good. The Chicago Sun-Times called it an excruciating, embarrassing, profoundly unfunny, poorly shot, and astonishingly tone-deaf screechfest. Although Daddario's performance usually shines even in poorly received films, not even that could help The Layover. Ultimately, even though this film might be Daddario's worst-rated effort, her ability to succeed, even if only for a scene or two, emphasizes her strengths as an actor. Thankfully, there are much better films that showcase it than The Layover, so maybe spare yourself from checking it out.